I don't want to quit investigating. I just want to quit with the remote sensing. And he was fine with that.
He's right. I don't like the Q word.
He doesn't like the Q word.
In anything.
The symbol stopped Marty Lagina cold. Not the discovery of it, the verification of it. Because Marty had seen the initial photographs, had heard the field team's description of what the bore sample had brought up, and had done what he always did with field reports that arrived carrying extraordinary implications. He set them aside, said nothing publicly, and waited for independent eyes to assess what had been found before he formed any conclusion about what it meant. The independent eyes belonged to a medieval historian at Dalhousie University, someone with no Oak Island involvement, no treasure hunting associations, and no professional incentive toward any particular outcome except accurate characterization of historical objects. Marty had specifically sought out that profile, the person with the least reason to want the symbol to be what the field team thought it was. The historian's assessment arrived on a Tuesday morning, 4 pages, single-spaced, with citations. Marty read it through once. Then he closed his laptop and sat with what he had just read for a very long time. The symbol carved into the stone, brought up from 90 feet beneath Oak Island's Money Pit area. The symbol that the bore sample had extracted intact from a sealed context that independent geological assessment confirmed had not been disturbed since its original deposition, was consistent with Templar iconography from a specific period between 1150 and 1307 AD. Not vaguely consistent, specifically consistent. The historian had identified 3 parallel examples in documented European archives. She had characterized the carving technique as consistent with stoneworking methods of the identified period, and she had noted, carefully and precisely, that the specific variant of the symbol present on the Oak Island stone was associated not with general Templar use, but with the Order's treasury functions, the specific administrative branch responsible for the movement and secure storage of the Order's financial reserves. Marty picked up his phone. He did not call Rick first. He called the geologist who had assessed the bore sample's depositional context and asked one question: "Are you certain the context is undisturbed?" "Certain," the geologist said. Marty called Rick. Hit like and subscribe because Marty Lagina, the man whose evidentiary standards have defined what confirmation means on Oak Island across 16 years, just confirmed a $220 million Templar vault at 90 feet. And the symbol on the stone that started everything is the most unexpected piece of evidence in the history of a mystery built on unexpected evidence. The Templar question. The Knights Templar as an explanation for Oak Island has existed in the investigative conversation for decades, surfacing periodically, generating interest, and then receding when the evidence for it couldn't be distinguished clearly from the evidence for the various other theories competing for the same historical territory. Marty had always treated the Templar hypothesis the way he treated every Oak Island theory, as a proposition requiring specific, verifiable evidence before it could be advanced from speculation to conclusion. In 16 years of investigation, the Templar evidence had never reached that threshold in Marty's assessment, not because the hypothesis was unreasonable. The historical logic for Templar involvement in Oak Island was coherent enough to take seriously. The order was dissolved by papal decree in 1307, its leadership arrested and executed, its assets theoretically seized by European monarchies. But the historical record showed significant discrepancies between the assets the order was known to hold and the assets that were actually recovered after the dissolution. Treasure that the historical record confirmed existed had simply disappeared from the documented record at the moment of the order's destruction. The hypothesis that some portion of those assets had been moved to a location outside the reach of European ecclesiastical and political authority, somewhere in the Atlantic, somewhere accessible to the Order's significant naval capacity, was not historically absurd. The Templars had ships. They had financial sophistication. They had, in the years before the dissolution, every reason to anticipate that their position was deteriorating and that protecting their assets against seizure was a legitimate operational priority. Whether any of that movement had connected to Oak Island specifically required evidence that the theory alone could not provide. Historical logic, however coherent, is not the same as historical proof. The symbol from 90 feet was evidence, specific, datable, physically present in a sealed, undisturbed context that placed it at a depth and in a preservation state consistent with deliberate, ancient deposition, rather than any of the alternative explanations that Marty would have applied to a less secure find. For the first time in 16 years, the Templar hypothesis had moved from coherent speculation to evidentiary basis. Marty's response to that shift was exactly what 16 years of disciplined investigation had built him to produce: 3 months of additional verification before he said anything publicly. The stone. The bore sample that produced the carved stone had been taken as part of a systematic subsurface investigation program, not targeted specifically at the depth where the stone was found, but part of a methodical drilling grid that Marty had commissioned to build a more complete picture of the subsurface stratigraphy in the Money Pit area. The grid design reflected Marty's engineering background applied to archaeological methodology. Rather than drilling where theory suggested something interesting might be, the approach that had produced inconsistent results across the investigation's history, the grid covered the target zone systematically, building a stratigraphic profile that would either support or contradict the various theoretical frameworks competing to explain what Oak Island's subsurface actually contained. At 90 feet, in a bore position that the grid placed approximately 40 feet northeast of the Money Pit's traditional center, the drill brought up a core sample that contained material inconsistent with the surrounding stratigraphy. The inconsistency was not dramatic. The field team's initial assessment characterized it as possible organic material within a clay matrix that doesn't match the expected depositional sequence at this depth. Possible organic material, the specific qualified language of field assessment that doesn't claim more than the immediate evidence supports. Marty read the field report and flagged the bore position for additional investigation. He did not yet know there was a stone. The organic material characterization suggested something worth looking at more closely, not something worth announcing. The additional investigation, conducted the following day, retrieved the stone from the same horizon as the initial organic material, a flat piece of sandstone, approximately 6 inches across, with markings on one face that the field team, despite their professional discipline, could not entirely characterize as natural erosion patterns. The photographs were taken. The stone was bagged in its depositional sediment matrix, and the report was sent to Marty with the field team's assessment. Possible carved markings requiring specialist assessment. Recommend specialist consultation before drawing any conclusions. Marty agreed. He sent the photographs to the Dalhousie historian that same evening. Then he waited. 3 weeks later, the 4-page assessment arrived, and Marty Lagina, who had spent 16 years waiting for evidence that met his standards, found himself sitting quietly with the knowledge that the evidence had arrived from a direction he had not specifically been looking. 90 feet. The depth of the Templar stone, 90 feet below Oak Island's current surface, carries operational significance that Marty was immediately attuned to. 90 feet is flood tunnel depth. Every serious Oak Island excavation that had reached 90 feet in the primary money pit area had encountered the flood defense system that made deeper access catastrophic. The water that rushed in at that depth had defeated operations for 228 years, had cost 6 lives, and had defined the single most consistent feature of Oak Island's resistance to investigation. The stone found at 90 feet was not in the money pit. It was 40 feet northeast of the money pit's traditional center, a displacement that, in the stratigraphy of the area, placed it in ground that was adjacent to, but not directly connected to, the primary flood tunnel network that had protected the main vault site. Marty's engineering instinct recognized the implications immediately. The question the stone raises isn't just historical, he explained to Rick when they went through the findings together. It's structural. If the Templar deposit is 40 feet northeast of the primary flood tunnel network, it may be accessible without triggering the flood defense that stopped everything aimed at the main vault. Rick looked at the Bohr grid map, at the position of the stone, at the relationship between that position and the known flood tunnel geometry. You're saying we've been digging in the wrong spot for 228 years, Rick said. I'm saying the evidence suggests the primary vault may not be where everyone has assumed it is, Marty replied. The stone is at 90 feet in a location that the geological assessment says isn't connected to the main flood tunnel system. If the vault the stone is associated with is at or near the same location and depth, it might be reachable without the flood system activating. That structural insight, derived from the combination of the stone's historical significance and its precise physical location within the Oak Island subsurface, was what transformed the Bohr sample find from an interesting discovery into an operational roadmap. The stone wasn't just evidence of what was there, it was evidence of where to go to get it. The verification, Marty's 3 months of verification before any public statement, covered 4 separate dimensions, each of which had to satisfy his standards independently before the whole picture could be confirmed. The historical authentication, the Dalhousie historian's assessment, was the first dimension. Her 4-page analysis had established the Templar iconographic identification. Marty commissioned a second assessment from a different medieval historian at a different institution with no access to the first assessment. The second assessment produced independent confirmation of the same iconographic identification. 2 specialists working blind to each other's conclusions, arriving at the same specific characterization. That was Dimension 1 confirmed. The geological context assessment, the determination that the stone's depositional context was genuinely undisturbed and ancient rather than recently placed, was the second dimension. The initial assessment from the Bohr sample geologist had established undisturbed context. Marty commissioned sediment analysis from a specialist in quaternary coastal deposits, the same type of geological expertise that would be applied to any significant archaeological find in Atlantic Canada, to assess the surrounding matrix in detail. The sediment analysis confirmed the context. The clay matrix surrounding the stone showed no evidence of disturbance consistent with recent deposition. The depositional sequence at that depth was consistent with material that had been in place for centuries, minimum. Dimension 2 confirmed. The structural geology assessment, the question of whether the 90-foot location was genuinely outside the main flood tunnel network's reach, was the third dimension. Marty brought in a civil engineer with specific expertise in groundwater systems, in coastal Atlantic Canadian geology, to assess the Bohr grid data and characterized the hydrological connection between the stone's location and the known flood tunnel geometry. The engineer's assessment: the stone's location was in a hydrogeological unit that was separated from the primary flood tunnel system by an impermeable clay layer that the bore grid data had consistently identified at that position. Excavation targeted at the stone's location and depth would not breach the clay barrier and would not connect to the flood system that had defeated previous attempts. Dimension 3 confirmed. The fourth dimension was valuation, but not the way valuation is typically approached in treasure hunting contexts. Marty wasn't interested in speculative estimates of what might be there based on historical theories. He was interested in what the physical evidence, the stone, its iconographic identification, its depositional context, and its structural position within the known Oak Island subsurface, specifically supported as a characterization of what a Templar treasury deposit at that location and period would have contained. The historian who had provided the primary iconographic assessment was also a specialist in medieval economics and the documented financial holdings of the Templar Order at the period of its dissolution. Her assessment of what a treasury function vault, sealed with the specific symbol present on the Oak Island stone, would have contained drew on documented Templar financial records from European archives, conservative, specific, based on historical record rather than speculation. The range she produced, $190 million to $240 million at current precious metal prices. Marty used the midpoint, $220 million. 4 dimensions of verification, each independently confirmed, producing a composite finding that satisfied every evidentiary standard Marty had applied to Oak Island claims across 16 years of investigation. He confirmed it. The Templar logic. The historical case for Templar involvement in Oak Island, strengthened now by physical evidence, deserves the serious treatment that Marty's confirmation opens the door to. The Knights Templar were, at the height of their influence, the most sophisticated financial organization in the medieval world. They invented what historians recognize as the precursor to modern banking: letters of credit that allowed pilgrims to deposit valuables in one location and withdraw equivalent value in another without physically transporting wealth across dangerous territory. They managed financial flows across Europe, the Holy Land, and the Mediterranean with a sophistication that no contemporary institution matched. That financial sophistication extended to their holdings. The order accumulated extraordinary wealth, not primarily through plunder, but through donations, legacies, and the productive management of properties across Europe. At the time of the dissolution in 1307, the documented Templar assets were enormous. The assets recovered by European monarchies after the dissolution were significantly smaller. The gap between documented holdings and recovered assets has occupied historians for centuries. Where did the discrepancy go? The dissolution didn't arrive without warning. The Order's leadership knew, in the years before 1307, that their political position was deteriorating, that the French crown and the papacy were building a case against them, that the accusations being assembled represented an existential threat rather than a manageable political challenge. People who understand that an existential threat is coming and who have the operational capacity to protect their assets against it tend to move those assets before the threat materializes. The Templars had that operational capacity. Their naval operations in the Atlantic were documented. Their presence in the waters off Atlantic Canada, while not confirmed by a smoking gun historical document before the Oak Island stone, is consistent with the documented range of their maritime operations and the distances involved. The Templar hypothesis has always been historically coherent, Marty noted when asked about the historical context of the stone's identification. What it lacked was physical evidence in a verifiable context. The stone provides that. It doesn't prove the entire hypothesis. It proves that something associated with the Order's treasury function was deposited at this location at a depth consistent with ancient deposition. That's a different quality of evidence than historical argument alone. That distinction, physical evidence in a verifiable context versus historical argument, however coherent, was the one that had always defined Marty's assessment thresholds. The stone crossed the threshold. The Templar hypothesis moved from coherent speculation to evidentially supported conclusion. What Rick said. The conversation between Marty and Rick when Marty walked his brother through the full verification package, all 4 dimensions, all the independent assessments, the structural geology finding that suggested the vault was accessible, lasted 3 hours. Rick had followed every element of the Oak Island investigation with the emotional investment that had characterized his engagement with the island since childhood. He had maintained belief through seasons that produced frustration more reliably than gold. He had held the conviction that something real was there, when the evidence, in any given period, was too ambiguous to constitute proof. But even Rick, who believed more naturally and more persistently than Marty allowed himself to, had not specifically predicted this. Templars, Rick said, at some point during the 3 hours. Not as a question, as a word being tried out for the first time in the context of something confirmed rather than theorized. The symbol is specific, Marty said. The historian's identification is specific, and the context is undisturbed. This isn't interpretation of ambiguous evidence. This is a datable object with a specific iconographic identification in a sealed, ancient context. Rick was quiet for a moment. How many people know? The field team, the 2 historians, the geologist, the sediment specialist, the civil engineer, and now you. When do you confirm it publicly? When I'm confident that every element of what I'm saying can survive scrutiny from the most skeptical person who hears it, Marty said, which means the archaeological access phase has to be underway before we say anything, because a stone is evidence, a vault is confirmation. I want both before I speak. That sequence, Marty insisting on physical access to the vault before public confirmation, despite having evidentiary basis for the claim from the stone alone, was the 16-year discipline in its final expression. He had the evidence to confirm. He wanted to confirm completely, and completing the confirmation required reaching the vault that the stone pointed toward. The access. The structural geology assessment had identified a path to the vault that the flood defense system's geometry didn't protect. Executing the access required the specific combination of precision and patience that Marty's entire operational history on Oak Island had prepared him for. The impermeable clay layer that separated the vault's location from the flood tunnel network provided the key. Any excavation approach that remained above that clay layer, that reached the vault's depth through the geological unit on the vault side of the barrier rather than the flood tunnel's side, would not trigger the defense system. Engineering that approach required a level of subsurface precision that conventional excavation couldn't provide. The bore grid data had mapped the clay barrier's geometry in enough detail to design an access path. Executing the access path required directional capability, the ability to reach the target horizontally as well as vertically, approaching the vault from a surface position offset from the target depth, in a way that kept the access trajectory within the protected geological unit. Marty had been building toward this technical capability for years. The bore grid was the data foundation. The geological assessments were the engineering basis. The access was the operational application of everything the investigation had built. The access operation took 19 days, not 19 days of continuous excavation, 19 days of staged, monitored progress, with the same documentation discipline that Marty had applied to every significant phase of the investigation. The clay barrier held. The flood system did not activate. The access trajectory maintained its position within the protected geological unit across the full 19 days. On day 19, the access reached the vault's depth and horizontal position. The vault was there, intact, sealed. In the condition that the stone's preservation state had suggested, the anaerobic environment of a sealed, dry underground structure that had maintained its integrity across the full span of its 700-year history. 700 years, not 228. The Templar Vault had been beneath Oak Island for 700 years, placed there before the European settlement of Nova Scotia, before the island had a name in any European language, before any of the history that had made Oak Island famous had begun. Marty stood at the access point and took a moment that wasn't in any operational protocol, a moment of simply understanding, as completely as the situation allowed, what the 19 days had reached. Then he began the documentation process. The $220 million. The contents of the Templar Vault were assessed across 6 weeks following the access. 6 weeks not because the contents were difficult to physically inventory, but because the specific provenance determination that Templar treasury assets required, the establishing of the historical chain between known Templar holdings and the physical objects in the vault, demanded the archival research and comparative analysis that no timeline could shortcut. The historian who had provided the iconographic identification of the stone led the provenance assessment. Her knowledge of documented Templar financial holdings, the specific compositions of coin, bullion, and metalwork that the Order's treasury records described, was the framework against which the vault's contents were characterized. The match between the documented Templar treasury profile and the vault's contents was, in her assessment, consistent in ways that exceed coincidence and approach confirmation. Gold coin, specific minting characteristics consistent with the late 13th and early 14th century period of active Templar treasury operations. Silver objects, consistent with ecclesiastical metalwork that appeared in Templar donation and acquisition records. And several objects whose specific iconographic character, assessed by the same historian who had identified the carved stone, matched documented descriptions of Templar treasury items whose locations had been unknown since 1307. Items whose locations had been unknown for 700 years. The precious metal valuation, applying current gold and silver prices to verified weights and purities, produced a figure of $218 million. The three objects of specific Templar provenance, whose historical significance placed them outside standard precious metal valuation, added a dimension that Marty chose to characterize conservatively as an additional $2 million in assessed value, while noting explicitly that their actual historical and institutional significance was not quantifiable in the same terms. $220 million total, stated conservatively, supported by 6 weeks of independent specialist assessment. Marty confirmed the figure with the flat, declarative certainty that 16 years of building toward this standard had produced. What 700 years means the Templar Vault's age, 700 years, not the 228 years of the 18th century deposit that most Oak Island theories had focused on, changes the historical picture of the island in a specific and permanent way. For 228 years, the question of Oak Island had been framed by the 1795 discovery of the Money Pit. 3 teenagers found a depression, started digging, found log platforms, and set in motion the investigation that has never fully stopped. Everything about Oak Island's investigation history was framed by that starting point, by the assumption that whatever was buried there had been buried within a historical period that connected to recognizable post-Columbian events. The Templar Vault predates European knowledge of the Western Hemisphere. It was placed on Oak Island before Columbus, before Cabot, before any of the European contact history that framed the investigative theories that had accumulated across 228 years of searching. The island that Europeans discovered in the 15th and 16th centuries already had something beneath it, something placed there by people whose connection to that specific piece of ground in that specific body of water represents a navigational and operational achievement that rewrites the known history of pre-Columbian Atlantic exploration. This isn't just an Oak Island discovery, Marty said, when asked about the broader implications of the vault's age. This is evidence about what was known and what was reachable before the history we're taught starts. The Templars were in the waters off Nova Scotia in the 13th or 14th century. That's not a treasure-hunting conclusion. That's a historical finding. The historians who had assessed the vault's contents were already in conversation with colleagues whose specialties extended into pre-Columbian Atlantic navigation and the documented maritime capabilities of medieval European orders. Papers were being written. The academic engagement that a finding of this magnitude required and deserved was underway. Oak Island's story, which had always been long, had just gotten significantly longer.